So, Cameron,
Yes.
tell me what you know about small Texas
I
towns.
refuse.
No, you must.
I know that small Texas towns, like it's 2024 right now, right?
Yes.
Okay. The ones that I'm familiar with are living in like 1994.
Okay. We both are familiar with a small town.
Both
It,
from
it,
small Texas towns.
yes, and we lived in the same small Texas town
I
and
did.
worked in the same small Texas
I lived
town.
in your hometown.
You did. And I do think that now they are living in 2024
No.
because my mom's that now they are living in 2024
No.
because my mom's internet is literally faster than mine. Like she is hooked up to fiber optic internet. I mean, they've got that much going for them. I also think that culturally they're kind of catching up with the times for the most part.
I don't know what to add to this because I don't know that I'm going to be able to set aside my prejudice.
Well, and I also think, I can be split on so many things, and of course, we know that nothing is ever static or black and white. But when we talk about small Texas towns, I think another common understanding that most people think of as safe. And
Do you mean white people?
I think a lot of people in general, I think that when we talk about the demographics of Texas, we can no longer just say white people.
But I also know that there are people who are not from Texas
Hmm.
who when they come to Texas, they are aware of and knowledgeable about where towns that are or used to be sundown towns are.
Hmm.
And so I guess that's more what I'm thinking of.
So I think, again, when we talk about those small towns, a lot of people, the majority of people, especially if they already reside in Texas or they have some kind of imagining of what a small town is and its features, they think,
They may think safe, but I don't think safe. I
I
think
know.
I think we I think of those places as where there's more of an inclination to excuse behavior like, oh well that's just locker room talk. I think of them as something that is supposed to be quote unquote safe, but I don't think of them as actually safe. If you're talking perception, sure, there might be a perception that small towns are safe.
Right. I think that's the prevailing conception is that they are safe, they're tight knit, they care for each other, they operate as a unit. But I think you're definitely right in the truth of what a small town can be, which is partial, protected, gossipy, this kind of continual protection of predators or people who practice predatory behavior. So let's talk about Caleb Diehl. On March 30th, 2015, Caleb Diehl and his sister, Courtney, would share their last conversation at their mother's home in Nocona, Texas. It was a Monday evening, just 2 weeks after Caleb's 18th birthday, and Caleb had missed school that day. Courtney, as she was about to leave her mother's home, saw Caleb sitting on her mother's couch tying his shoes.
Was Courtney older or younger?
Courtney is his older sister.
Okay.
Are you coming home tonight? Because you can't miss any more school, she asked him. Yes, I'm coming home, Caleb replied, without looking up. And that was the last conversation that anyone in Caleb's family would have with him prior to his disappearance.
I have a question.
Okay.
Where the fuck is Nocona, Texas?
Well, this case kind of revolves around three locations: Nocona,
Mm-hmm.
Grapevine,
Mm-hmm.
and
Okay.
Bedford,
Okay.
which are all close to.
Dallas.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know, but I know they're close to the DFW Metroplex area.
Yeah. That's what I mean when I say Dallas.
Yeah. And just for reference, because it will be important later, Nocona is where the family essentially grew and existed. And Nocona is roughly an hour and a half away from Grapevine and an hour and a half away from Bedford. And Bedford and Grapevine are only 13 miles apart. So I think they're both kind of part of the greater suburbs, of the DFW area, but Nakona is kind of off on its own.
Yeah.
And Nakona also had a population of 3,000 people.
Smaller than my small town, but bigger than yours.
Bigger than mine, smaller than yours. Caleb Diehl was born on March 15th, 1997. He was the youngest of the Diehl family, the baby. And according to his father, Chad, they knew in advance that Caleb would be their final child. Caleb was unique and adventurous and described by all of his siblings and parents as being fearless. Despite his fearlessness, his older sister Courtney often said that Caleb acted like the baby of the family. And there wasn't a lot of elaboration on that, but as the baby of the family, I think I understand what she's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly don't have a fearlessness about me. So
I think there's, right, you can be fearless and also be a baby. You can also act like the baby of the family and not be fearless. I think that if you wanted to put it in the context of the family dynamic, as a baby, you tend to be coddled a little bit more and more is forgiven. So there is a fearlessness in your approach to, as the oldest child, there is never a fearlessness in my approach to dealing with my parents.
there were some times where my sister was fearless in her approach with our parents.
I want to say that as the oldest, I was definitely the most willing to go toe to toe. And my sister will tell you that she learned a lot about what not to do. Or, okay, this had that reaction, so don't do that.
Yes.
And so because you've had an example above you that you've learned from, you're able to operate a little bit more fearlessly because you know the big ticket items of what not to do. And then you also know that you're the baby and you get away with more stuff anyway. So it's
Right.
like it works twofold if you wanted to put it in that context. I don't think his is in that context. I think one, boy, which is already, especially a typical small town Texas boy.
Right.
I'm thinking four-wheelers. I'm thinking going out and just getting into boy shit.
Well, and you're absolutely right, because that's the connotation that she speaks of him in. And one of the things that really characterizes Caleb as a child is that he wanted to emulate his father. And oftentimes he would also don a welding hood while his father was welding because he wanted to be like him. And he was so fearless and adventurous that at the age of 4, his father bought him a 1-gear Yamaha dirt bike.
Interesting.
So, kind of exactly what you said. And they said that Caleb would constantly fall on this dirt bike, but that every time he fell, he would just get back up and start dirt biking again. So, already showcasing a strong resilience and fearlessness at 4 years old. Another really poignant story that I want to share with you that I think kind of expresses who Caleb grew into is that as a teenager, Caleb's entire family, his mother, father, and his 3 siblings all went to the Grand Canyon. And Caleb's fearlessness, his courage, he had to be the first one to rush down into the canyons, get a scope of everything that was down there. But on the way back up, he was the last person to make it back up to the top. And he had stayed behind because his mother was really struggling to get back up.
Mm-hmm.
And so he stayed behind to help her. And one of the things, a lot of the information I'm sharing today comes from a docuseries called Never Seen Again on Paramount Plus.
Started watching that this week with my sister and her fiance.
Did you like it?
I only watched 4 episodes because they break each case into 2 episodes.
I don't think they do that in the second season. Like Caleb Diehl's episodes, there's 2. But after that, I think they're all 1 episode. I don't know why.
I was surprised that the second case was also a 2-episode piece.
Okay.
Because I expected they did a bigger case, broke it into 2 episodes for the first 2 episodes, and then it was just going to be one-offs after that. But
so back to Caleb. In the series, his mother talks about how her other kids couldn't be less concerned about her well-being. They were already back up. Her husband was already back up. But Caleb was the one who recognized that she was struggling, and he made sure he stayed behind her so that she would get back up safely. And that also seems like baby of the family activity to me, because I'm always worried about my mother. So making sure that mom is taken care of.
Maybe. I would always do that stuff like with my grandma.
Right.
I would be the one that would hang back.
It makes sense that you did that with your grandma. So the Diehl family lived in Nakona, a close-knit community where everyone knew each other. And Caleb, despite being the youngest, again was the most daring. He attended Prairie Valley School after a brief stint of homeschooling. I want to point out that when the Diehl family moved to Texas, and I can't remember where they were before Texas, I think it was Utah or Colorado. When they moved to Nakona, they decided they would homeschool their 4 children. While going over that, Chad, Caleb's father, talks about how, what a terrible mistake. Like, homeschooling did not work for us, and we sent them to Prairie Valley schools. And this is where the Diehl family would become acquainted with the Howard family. Ricky Howard was the patriarch of the Howard family, and he was a well-known businessman. He was even affectionately dubbed Mr. Nakona. He was involved in oil leases, cattle farming, and he was a former president of the local bank. Ricky was often looked at as like a second father or an uncle to the Diehl kids, especially Caleb.
How old were the kids when they came to Nakona?
I don't think any of the kids was very old when they came to Nakona. I think that Courtney is the oldest sibling, and Josh is the older brother, because there were 2 girls, Courtney and Haley, and then 2 boys, Josh and Caleb. I think that Courtney might be 8 years older than Caleb.
Okay.
And Caleb was the only one born in Texas.
Okay. So he was here his whole life.
He always lived in Nakona.
So this Howard family probably already knew the family when he was born.
Right. In a town of 3,000 people. And Ricky Howard is the president of the Soul Bank in Nakona. So yeah, I think that they knew who they were. The Diehl family and the Howard families became inseparable. They would spend weekends together. They went on vacations together. And Haley Diehl said that she really thought of those people as kind of a second family, and Ricky as kind of being the next prominent male figure in their life, aside from their dad. Caleb and his older brother Josh would often stay at Ricky's ranch, and they would help with cattle. They would go check oil leases for him, and Caleb would actually continue working for Ricky up until his disappearance. He did much of the same thing that he did before when his brother also helped. So again, cattle work, oil leases, and then other miscellaneous farm activities. And from what I understand, Mr. Nakona, Ricky Howard, he had lots of property. It's also expressed by Tammy Diehl that the Howard family was kind of a big deal in Nakona. There were lots of Howards in the community.
What's that like?
I can't even imagine. I've always had such a small, compact family.
You're a liar.
It can feel weird. However, as close as they were, Caleb's relationship with his parents faced its own challenges, like with almost any teenager. And by March 15th, 2005, Caleb's 18th birthday, his parents had separated. Chad had moved to Grapevine, and Caleb moved with him. But the tension between father and son grew.
Wait,
What does this have to do with his birthday?
no, you said that Caleb moved to Grapevine, which was an hour and a half from Nakona, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that he was still working on Howard's ranch up until he disappeared 15 days after he turned 18.
Correct. Hold on.
I'm holding.
Hold on. I'm going to get to that.
I mean, I assumed.
So Chad had moved to Grapevine, and Caleb had moved with him. Chad jokingly refers to himself as being oppressive in this docuseries, and talks about how he expected his son to clean up his room and contribute around the house, and that Caleb wasn't really feeling that. And so they would often have arguments. This kind of perpetual conflict led Caleb to moving in with his oldest sister, Courtney, in Bedford, which was about 13 miles away from the father, but again, still an hour and a half away from Nakona. A lot of the time that Caleb spent working for Ricky Howard was pretty exclusive to the weekends.
Was he going there every weekend?
I think so.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. From what I understand, yeah, Caleb would travel back and forth. On March 15th, 2015, Caleb, his mother, and his siblings all gathered to celebrate Caleb's 18th birthday in Nakona. And while there is video footage of Caleb and his family celebrating his birthday, there's this kind of haunting clip of Caleb's family singing to him, but he seems really distant. They're singing happy birthday to him, and there's no engagement with his family who is around him singing happy birthday, but rather it's like he's staring off into the distance. And it's this small piece of footage that's really kind of unsettling, at least to me.
Okay. I don't think it's that abnormal. There are so many people who don't like to be sung to or don't want to be the center of attention like that. Do I get that vibe from Fearless Caleb?
Right.
Probably not, but it also is an activity that is more about the people doing it than it is about the person they're singing for. So there are little fires lit in front of you. There's a delicious, hopefully, cake in front of you. And I can
love
see
blowing out candles.
yeah, I can see looking at the flames and then just like zoning out and not actually being there for the moment.
But it's not like he's looking at the flames.
I know he's
You'll
zoned
have
out.
to see it. It's really sorry. I know exactly what you just said, but I had to mention it because when I watched it, and of course it was in the context of a Gone Missing docuseries.
Probably with creepy music underneath or something.
I'm not sure if it was scored or not. Probably.
They're always doing
It was
things
just distance
that you don't even notice to make you feel a certain type of way
Right.
when you watch stuff like that.
Of course, 100%. It's in everything. Also, his family kind of talks about how something was amiss on his birthday. So I guess I should have added that.
Sure, he was 18. Did he have a girlfriend?
I have no idea. The answer is that I do have an idea, actually. No, there was no known girlfriend.
Had he had a girlfriend the day before?
There's no mention of a girlfriend.
I'm just kidding. I'm just saying if he was like a teenager going through a breakup, or, he's a teenager. There's so much that could cause this. Was his family celebrating together? Like, did his dad come?
His dad was the only one not there, and he had already moved out of Dad's house at this point.
Right.
Either way, just worth mentioning. 15 days later, on March 30th, 2015, Caleb was at his mother's house in Nakona again. He had told Courtney that he was going to go visit with a friend, but he planned to be back to their apartment that night. So again, Caleb lived with Courtney at this point in her apartment in Bedford, Texas.
Yeah. I'm following all that, but so he left Bedford to go to Nakona, but said he would be back that evening.
So it was the weekend. I think he was already in Nakona.
But he was tying his shoes.
Right. So this is a conversation that they had earlier.
Was Courtney in Nakona?
Yes.
Oh, okay. In my mind, Courtney was in Bedford.
No, Courtney was in Nakona.
They were both in Nakona, and she was leaving to go back to Bedford and was
Yes.
like, and hey, you can't miss school. And he said he would be there that night.
Correct.
And it's a Sunday?
This was a Monday. He had already missed school that day.
Okay. So many questions.
Listen, the way they travel between Nakona and Bedford is like no big deal. So,
Yeah, that's Texas for you.
yeah, it is.
But I guess I missed that it was a Monday that he had missed school, and it seems weird that she was there on the Monday, but...
Well, and here's the real deal. It's funny you bring that up, and I was hoping you wouldn't.
Oh, good.
Because
You're welcome.
in the source material between the docuseries Never Seen Again and another source that I can't remember the name of yet, but we'll have listed, they report different dates. And then there is another article and a Reddit thread about how there's disagreement over whether this conversation took place on March 29th, that Sunday, or March 30th, that Monday. And part of the reason I think there's kind of this confusion about when, of course, different people reporting, different sources, but also the way Caleb lived and the way he stayed with his family kind of meant that he might be navigating between different places at different times. And I don't know if anyone was keeping close tabs on him. I don't think there was necessarily one location people expected to find him at any given time.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, he's flitting between these assumably 3 homes. I guess 4 homes if you're going to include the Howard property that he was working on so much. But he's going between these 4, and there's no consistent, this person expects him at this place at this time, because there's no routine, because he's a teenager.
Right.
With all of these different options and places that he is welcome to be at.
Well, and one of the things, and I questioned whether I should even include this or not, but Haley, his sister, in the series kind of talks about how Caleb went through a few years where he was kind of that typical rebellious teenager, didn't listen to anything, was partying, and kind of the insinuation about having fun like teenagers do, to me, was using substances that aren't meant for teenagers. And that's kind of the understanding that I have about where Caleb was at that time, mentally, emotionally, with being a teenager.
Right.
You know what's also oddly haunting about this case is we're talking about a missing person, but he went missing so recently, just 2015.
9 years.
Like, there's a social media presence out there. His account, there's
Well,
videos of him doing like viral dances.
My second year teaching would have been his senior year of high school. He would have been in my class if he had been in a different small Texas town.
Right. It's just weird to conceptualize that I'm at an age and we're at a place in our culture and time where people who go missing, and it's these cases where someone's been missing for nearly 10 years, they had a social media presence.
That was your first year teaching.
It was. What a pleasure. I never wanted to quit at all that first year. I certainly didn't have a friend who talked me into staying.
Catherine.
I definitely don't remember a vivid conversation on the track where my friend was like, you can make it till the end of the year. You can do it. Just stick with it. It'll get better. Do you remember her name?
I don't remember any of this.
Oh, her name is Cameron.
I don't remember this.
We were walking on the track and it was in the morning. And I remember it, I think, so clearly because I hated doing it in the morning. And I only did that like 3 times. And we were walking and I was like, I want to quit so bad.
We walked in the morning?
We were walking in the morning. You walking with me in the morning happened once. And I walked in the morning 3 times before I said, I'll go walk in the heat. And it was towards the end of the school year. We only had like 6 weeks left. And I was like, I want to quit. I hate this shit so much. And you were like, no, we're almost done. Don't quit. It gets better. And I was like,
year 2. Was year 2 better than year 1?
Where? Anyway, so what even were we talking about? Where was I?
You were saying that he has a social media presence, which is...
Okay. Wow, talk about a digression. So again, back to that final conversation where Courtney reminded Caleb that he needed to go to school, that he should not be missing any more school because he was in danger of not graduating.
For the record, I did check the date of Easter that year because I was wondering if maybe Easter was the 29th of March. But no, Easter was the following Sunday.
Well, and then here...
Why are you whispering?
Well, because I didn't include it in the case, but now that you say that, I might as well. When Caleb goes missing, they know that something is really wrong because he doesn't come home for the Easter weekend. Like, he's not with his family. And several of his family members had a birthday at that time, and he hadn't reached out to any of them. And both of those things were really out of character for Caleb.
Okay.
So that evening, after talking to his sister, Caleb left around 5 p.m. from his mother's home, driving a loaner truck from Ricky Howard, a Champagne Chevy 2500, as his own truck had broken down. Now, this is the same truck that he would often use when he was doing errands for Ricky or working on his properties. And so, no big deal. It was typical. His truck had broken down, so he was using the work truck he often used from Ricky. The next morning, Courtney didn't see her brother, but that wasn't super unusual. He might have left before her. Maybe he did end up staying somewhere else that night. However, by Wednesday, April 1st, Caleb still hadn't returned home. And Tammy, Caleb's mother, had received a phone call from the school counselor informing her that Caleb had not shown up to school again. Concerned, Tammy began calling Caleb's friend, including a young man named Christian. So Tammy is concerned at this point. She reaches out to some of his friends, one in particular. Now, this isn't in every source, and it wasn't in the docuseries, but she evidently reached out to a friend named Christian, and that was who he was supposed to go see that night he went missing. And Christian tells her that he and Caleb never had any plans that evening. As a matter of fact, he was out of town. So that it wouldn't have made sense.
I mean, I think it makes sense.
Well, yes, but in terms like of teenage behavior, sure, but that's not where he really was.
Right.
This further, obviously, bothered Tammy and Caleb's family. Now, somewhere in the hustle of all of this, Caleb's family looked in the different rooms that he might have been staying in at their homes. They didn't find any evidence of an extended stay in mind. So most of his clothes were still there. Everything was in its typical order and fashion. And they couldn't find any signs of him leaving somewhere and planning to be gone. I saw you smile.
Because when you said that they looked in rooms that he might have stayed in, I thought that they were looking for him. I was like, we didn't do that. we, we didn't start there.
Well, and it was kind of weird phrasing because he had more than one, because between his mom's house and his sister's apartment, by that same afternoon, Tammy would report Caleb as missing to the Nakona police. Calls to Caleb's phone went straight to voicemail, and none of his friends had seen or heard from him.
How did the police respond? Did they say he's 18, he's allowed to go missing, he's an adult?
So there's no real detail, like in terms of did the police have an immediate reaction? But again, there is still this kind of pervasive attitude around Caleb going missing that is, it wouldn't be totally out of fashion for him to do this. So at this point in time, it's 2 days after they've last seen him. And so I don't even know. They're worried, they're concerned, but I don't know if it's to a point of, oh my God, where's my son?
Okay, so between all of these houses that he could stay in, because I know that he moved out of his dad's house, but I think in theory he probably still could have gone and stayed there, but didn't.
Well, and not only that, again, there's so many details I left out for the sake of brevity, but he had not talked to his father since he moved out, and he moved out weeks to months before his birthday.
Okay.
So that was doubtful for them. I don't know if he was necessarily not talking to his dad, but he wasn't speaking with him.
Yeah.
So again, Caleb had recently turned 18 and had no known communication with anyone since March 30th. Ricky Howard visited Tammy Diehl, and he offered an explanation for Caleb's disappearance.
When?
Shortly after, in the same week he goes missing. He claims that Caleb had mentioned going to help a girlfriend's relative in Oklahoma to do some work, and he assured Tammy that Caleb would be back soon. Ricky emphasized there was absolutely no reason for the Diehl family to be worried. Believe it or not, the Diehl family was very much worried.
Whose girlfriend?
Well, exactly. No one knew of Caleb having any girlfriend.
I don't think you just up and go to Oklahoma either.
I'll get to it. As days turned into weeks, the community began speculating about Caleb's disappearance. Again, small town Texas, 3,000 people. Various theories emerged, and they ranged from Caleb moving to another state, such as Colorado or California, both being things that Caleb had talked about in the past to his friends, both things that he had spoken to his friends about in the past. Now, I want to make sure that the listeners understand that there is no qualification of the seriousness of these conversations. It sounds like it was something that Caleb might have said really in passing.
I'm not going to put that. I would have a very hard time being convinced that even if he wanted to move to those places, even if he was going to move to those places, that he would have just up and done it without talking to his family about it. I think maybe if this was, sometimes people go and they have midlife crises or whatever, but it seems like he wasn't under anyone's thumb. At 18, that's when you move out. That's when you go and go start living your life. So I don't think that there would have been any issue with his family if that's what he was going to do. So it would be a hard sell for me to believe that he just up and moved.
Right. It's
In the middle of a Monday, just middle of a Monday. Hey, you know what? Colorado, here I come.
it's kind of a preposterous theory, but as someone who grew up in a small town, I 100% believe that that's something that a community would develop as an idea. Additionally, District Attorney investigators Kevin Benton and Chris Hamilton, they ensured that Caleb Diehl's likeness and fingerprints were distributed to transportation hubs across the United States. And had he applied for some kind of identification or license in another state, those fingerprints would have automatically alerted authorities, and we would know that Caleb Diehl was still alive. There was also speculation that Caleb had maybe fallen into the wrong crowd and had begun selling drugs or completing illicit activities for them. It's important to note this is an idea that Tammy, his mother, had on her own. So, kind of goes back to what Haley had said before about how her brother had kind of made some mistakes, was a little too party hardy for those years leading up to his 18th birthday.
It also might be a long cry from made some mistakes, was partying a lot, to was dealing drugs and was so enmeshed in the drug dealing trade that it would have cost him his life. I think that's another, that is more so what I think about for small towns, is they've got these ideas about the big city and like all of those things that they associate with the big city. Like we're probably talking he was selling marijuana, and they're treating it like he is, if he were selling it, which I'm not even saying he was. Just to clarify,
there was never any kind of like,
but this idea that he was selling drugs and linking that to his disappearance it's a little bit absurd to me, because like I was saying, they kind of ascribe this like, oh, well then it was probably, they're thinking like inner city level of, oh, well, we're going to disappear this person because they're stepping on our, which it's not. That's a small town prejudice that's pretty common, like against big cities and
I think the added layer is that we're talking about someone who, he lived in Nakona, he lived in Bedford, he had lived in Grapevine, and he moved around all of these places kind of continuously. And I'm not just talking about this community's idea of what could have happened to him, but like that was his mother's concern.
Right.
So I understand what you're talking about in terms of like, oh, well, this is my idea of what happens to drug dealers based on what I've seen on.
But I'm saying the mom.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about.
Right. I don't want to be dismissive of her fears.
No, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the fears, but I am saying that there's probably an inflation of the situation if he was involved in dealing any type of illicit substance.
Right. Well, and ultimately, the Diehl family feels similar to you. They're desperate for answers, but none of these theories that people have come to them with seem to really fit who Caleb was, or at least who they knew him to be. His family unanimously believes that if Caleb had decided he was going to leave, he would have told them. And they don't think it's plausible because Caleb actually had an interview for a new job lined up. And he knew that his sister depended on him and his rent money.
The thing that stands out the most to me at this point is that someone close to him, close to the family, would insert this story or this theory about what was going on and why no one was able to contact him, because I'm sure that's part of the issue. This is 2015. He had a phone. He had a cell phone. And I'm assuming that people could not get in touch with him, hence the concern.
And no activity on any kind of social media platform.
For an 18-year-old.
Yeah.
Which, that's not to say that all 18-year-olds are posting every day or anything, but
they're communicating with their friends. In most instances, 18-year-olds are using those different platforms. They are using their phone. And to go radio silent is virtually unheard of.
Right. And then for somebody to come in and be like, oh, well, he went to Oklahoma to help out this person. It's just sus, if we're going to get into 18-year-old lingo.
Yeah, very sus.
Sus.
So, despite the kind of fringe theories Authorities still investigated all of them. At this point, when we're talking about the time that had elapsed since he'd gone missing, again, this is pretty early on, Courtney began reaching out to Caleb's friends directly, and they were able to verify that they had. It's so funny you just mentioned the girlfriend in Oklahoma, because when Courtney reached out to these friends, that was her question. She was following up on that lead from Ricky Howard, and all of his friends essentially said he doesn't have a girlfriend. He never shared anything about a girlfriend. And as a matter of fact, that weekend before he went missing, when we were all hanging out, there were no girls anywhere.
Well,
So,
when would he be able to have a girlfriend? Because I don't think that somebody who, to the point you made earlier, somebody who driving an hour and a half is no big deal for on a regular basis.
it seems like he was doing it every day. It seems like he drove to Nakona every day and drove home every day to Bedford.
So when would he have time to have the girlfriend? Because if he's willing to drive like that, drive those distances at and that frequency, then even if he did have a girlfriend in Nakona, I mean, let's be honest, this is not that far from Oklahoma. So if it's close to the Oklahoma-Texas border, then he would definitely go drive to see the girlfriend.
Right.
So when? Because he was going and staying, he was going, I guess, daily, if not every weekend, to Nakona. And then when would he have had time?
That's a great question. And I think that it kind of speaks to where Caleb's case goes next. So after Courtney finds out that there is no girlfriend, there's no even hint of involvement with the girl, attention turns back to Ricky Howard.
As it should. Why would you step up to introduce a theory, and not just a theory, but say it like this is what happened? Not, well, maybe this is what happened. No, this is what happened. There's no need to be concerned. He went to go help out this hypothetical, theoretical girlfriend's grandmother in a different state. Didn't tell anybody. Didn't take his phone.
That no one knows about.
Right. And then he's still gone a week and a half later. Okay. That lie can only go so far. So where did it come from?
Mm-hmm. Things become more interesting when you consider that on April 1st, when Tammy first reported Caleb missing. Now, she reported this to Chief Holcomb of the Nakona PD. And really and truly, despite the fact that it wasn't necessarily a huge deal or super worrisome that Caleb was missing, or it wouldn't be to most people given his circumstances, the police do kind of hop into action. They are ready to start searching for Caleb Diehl. And Tammy calls Ricky Howard and doesn't get an answer, but she leaves a voice message. And she says, I just want to let you know that the police are probably going to call and ask you some questions about your truck because that's the last thing that Caleb was driving. And in a matter of hours, Ricky calls her back and says he'd found the truck at his home, back in its normal place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this struck everyone as being a little odd. But despite the family being skeptical, they were also desperate. And along with police, they went to Ricky Howard's property, to the barn where he kept the truck. And when they got there, they found 3 $100 bills zip-tied to the steering wheel. But Ricky had an explanation for that.
Who doesn't zip tie $100 bills to their steering wheel? It's a Texas thing.
That's what I do with all of my loose $100 bills. But Ricky's explanation is that he knew that Caleb was behind on the rent and that he would want to make sure Courtney got the money. So that's probably why he zip-tied the $100 bills to the steering wheel.
I don't even have the energy to get into why the fuck that's not true.
Caleb's family also kind of felt the same way you did.
Am I a deal?
And they said, you know what? We actually don't think that Caleb did this because $300 is more than what he owed. And Caleb would have never overpaid his sister for rent. So, first off, right, red flag. Zip-tied money to the steering wheel.
Okay, one, in my opinion, Ricky did something.
No.
That is my opinion.
Mr. Nakona?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Ricky Nakona Howard? Yeah. That is my opinion.
Ricky Mr. Nakona Howard.
No.
He was a bank president.
In my opinion, something happened. I would love to know what could have happened. Because how old is this man?
Listen, hold on, because I haven't even got to the weirdest part. So,
Bro.
Ricky Howard, he's there on the scene, and police are there.
And so is his truck, and so is Caleb's car, and then we've got zip ties with $300 bills.
He tells the police, he's like, oh, yeah, he must have used my zip ties, that he knew where my zip ties were, and he must have used those to put the $100 bills on the steering wheel. Explaining that Caleb had used his zip ties to zip tie the money to the steering wheel. He didn't do that. That was Caleb.
What the fuck does that matter?
Exactly. Super weird information to share. And then...
Was Caleb's DNA on the zip ties?
Oh, I don't even know the answer to that. Ricky's behavior raised more suspicion.
How old is this man?
At this time, I believe he was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. He directed investigators to check the truck's engine. It was warm, and then Ricky
and it
says...
had money zip tied into it.
Ricky was like, oh my God, the engine's warm? He must have just been here. I thought I saw... He just was here. He was just here. He just dropped this off and left. I don't know where he went, but he put the keys back exactly where he was supposed to put the keys back.
Oh, so he came back from Oklahoma, returned the truck, but left the money in it.
With no other vehicle to leave in, and just skedaddled. Yeah, it was super normal. And Ricky offered...
Have they been able to get a warrant to search this man's property?
Hold on.
I don't need to hold on.
Because the final cherry on this cake, the police leave. They've gathered all of their information. And later, Ricky Howard calls back in the same day to say, you know what? Caleb's cell phone was here, but it was broken. So I just went ahead and destroyed it and threw it away.
I just feel like you're telling me all of the stuff that doesn't matter because this guy, in my opinion, is responsible for this disappearance. And I'm going to go as far as to say it is my belief that Caleb is dead. And it is my opinion that Caleb's body is somewhere on that property.
Well, investigators were of the same opinion as you, and they got a warrant to search Ricky's property. Now, when they searched, they used dogs, and from what I understand, he had multiple properties, not all connected. And at one of the properties, there was a burn pit. And in this burn pit was 3 computers and a phone, all burned what they assumed was recently.
Oh, was it still warm?
But Ricky explained that all of these devices actually belonged to his now deceased parents. And
yeah, where are those bodies?
And that he was just merely disposing of them responsibly by burning them in
Burning them?
Pit. At this time, Ricky also shares that he believes that Caleb had stolen... I don't know why you would tell the police this. That at one of his properties where he had a camper trailer, that he believed Caleb had gone in
and stolen the zip ties.
And stolen a covert camera clock radio from the camper.
It sounds horrible. He sounds like a horrible person.
Well,
he should probably have his life ended by the hands of somebody.
What a terrible crime to steal a covert camera clock radio from your camper. That was really important to note while authorities were trying to find information about Caleb Diehl and his disappearance.
You mean the camera that probably caught his murder and then was streamed to those devices, auto-saved to at least one of those devices somewhere in the cloud?
I have no tech timeline because I didn't even think about that. I didn't even think about cloud computing as a potential location for material. Despite all of these oddities and kind of weird happenings...
Weird.
Ricky Howard maintained that he was innocent.
Innocent of what?
Well, you know what's also weird is they say that Ricky Howard had multiple explanations for where Caleb was.
He did.
So after the thing didn't go anywhere with Oklahoma, he found other excuses for where Caleb Diehl might be. Also, Ricky Howard kind of visited Tammy a couple of times after Caleb had gone missing.
To find out what they knew? He would know once they knew something because it would be on his property.
So
in my opinion.
the belief is that Ricky Howard was just there to share the information he knew. So he would go by to share his stories and his thoughts about where Caleb might be. Backing up to the night that Caleb disappeared, Ricky Howard showed up to Tammy's home roughly 4 hours after Caleb's departure. He brought by a $200 check for work that Caleb had supposedly done over the weekend. Tammy thought this was really odd since she knew that Caleb had been with friends all weekend and not working. This was also the first time Ricky had ever given Caleb's check directly to Tammy, his mother, which also added to her suspicions.
Yeah.
Now, it didn't add to her suspicions immediately, but in retrospect, when she was looking back, because at that point she didn't know he was missing.
Right.
But he shows up 4 hours, 9 p.m., after Caleb goes missing to bring by a check.
Just undo the zip ties and give her $200.
So by April 6th, 2015, the same year, we're about 2 weeks after his disappearance.
April 6th?
No, we're about a week after his
no,
disappearance.
we're not.
I'm not here to do math. Tammy's doubts were so strong that she returned back to the police. Courtney, Caleb's sister, had found Ricky's constant excuses for Caleb's disappearance to be unsettling and suspicious. Both shared their fears with Caleb's dad, Chad. When Tammy arrived to the police station, the police chief's immediate question to her was about Ricky Howard, confirming her fears. Investigator DA Chris Hamilton was also concerned about what he assumed was likely Ricky's involvement in Caleb's disappearance. At this point, the Diehl family had become convinced that Ricky Howard had something to do with Caleb's disappearance. And Chad Diehl essentially couldn't stand it anymore. And he actually confronted Ricky Howard and told him, "I think that you're responsible for my son's disappearance, and I think that you've killed him." To which he said Ricky Howard had no immediate reaction, no kind of change in posture or gesture or in face.
Or nobody, no reaction that would be assumed to be typical of somebody who was not aware of anything to do with the whereabouts of this person.
Your longtime friend, who your families have intermingled with and interconnected with for years, nearly 2 decades, and you have no response to this man who said you were like a brother, saying that you think that you killed his son. And instead, he just plainly said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." In the searches of Ricky Howard's property, numerous firearms were found. Now, this is Texas, right? There's nothing unusual about firearms being on someone's property, multiple firearms. I think I have a cousin who has 3 gun safes and then lots of more guns that are just out in the open.
I lived with a couple that had guns everywhere. And my ex had guns everywhere.
Just guns on guns.
The nightstand looked like an artillery.
Yeah, yeehaw howdy. Welcome to the Lone Star State, where a gun is just as common as a cell phone.
That might be a gross exaggeration.
Is it gross? Maybe it's an exaggeration. But guns are so common.
Yeah, as common as cell phones?
I'd said exaggeration, just not a gross exaggeration.
It's still a gross exaggeration.
Maybe.
There may be as many guns as there are people, but that's because some people have an artillery of guns.
So they found these firearms, multiple firearms, at Ricky's home. Now, again, typically this wouldn't be a big deal, but Ricky was a convicted felon.
For what?
Ricky had been charged, indicted, and sentenced for bank fraud in the year 2000. This discovery of the weapons led to further investigation into Ricky's past.
Bank fraud.
Hold on. We're gonna see how it's all connected.
But I just feel like he probably wasn't defrauding the bank. Probably just zip-tied the money to the bushes outside or something.
Yeah, that's exactly what he did. After finding these weapons and kind of pushing the investigation further, realizing that Ricky Howard was a convicted felon, a dark and disturbing pattern of behavior came to light. Enter Special Agent David Burns of the FBI. David Burns was the initial FBI agent who had investigated Ricky Howard before. And in November of 2000, during a case involving fraudulent loans and the then bank president, Ricky Howard, a bank client revealed that Ricky had sexually abused her son. This revelation opened up a Pandora's box of allegations against Ricky Howard, including multiple instances of sexual abuse of young boys under the guise of helping them at some point with bank connections and transactions. Now, I really want to point out that this behavior of sexual abuse was really sinister and duplicitous. And it always is, right? But Ricky Howard would use his reputation as Mr. Nakona, as bank president, as a large landowner, and would find young boys who had a reputation somewhat similar to Caleb's, as in kind of a rebel, party, and would offer them weekend work on his farm, on his ranch. These boys would come stay at his ranch over the weekend, and he would sexually assault them. And what led to him being investigated for bank fraud was about the time that these young men would become juniors or seniors in high school. He would call them up and say, "Hey, I know it's about that time for you to get your driver's license. I bet you would like a nice new truck to drive around in." Or, "Hey, I know you're about to go off to college. I'm sure it would be nice to have money to go." And so he would call these boys into the bank and say that he was giving them a special scholarship that they would never have to pay back. And it was those bank loans.
So what he was doing is taking out loans and then dressing them up as not actually loans.
To the boys.
But paying for them?
I don't think so. I don't know who was put on the bank loan, but that's what led to him getting caught.
Well, it's idiotic to create another criminal scheme to cover up your criminal scheme.
It's also, I want to point out that not only did he try to bribe them in this way, but he coerced them by using threats of foreclosing on family property. So Chad, Caleb's father, after being in Nakona for a while, had kind of heard some rumors to that effect, but it was only ever about one boy named Cody Goolsby. And he didn't think much of it, right? A small town, rumors, one boy. And oftentimes the method, the tactic that Ricky Howard would use is he would simply say, "This family or this boy is trying to get back at me because I had to foreclose on something that they had a loan for, or I had to do something that harmed them financially." And none of that was ever true. These excuses he used, if anyone had been able to do due diligence, they would have known that that was a lie. In the docuseries, Never Seen Again, Ginger Waldrop, Cody's sister, shared that her brother had been abused by Ricky when he worked on Ricky's ranch. And in October of 1997, Cody was 25 years old, and he confessed to his parents what he had been put through at the hands of Ricky Howard. Cody Goolsby described that Ricky would have Cody come out to his ranch, and they would work until noon. Then they would go to the lake, and that is where Ricky would abuse Cody. Ultimately, Ricky would threaten Cody by saying that if he were to tell anyone what Ricky was doing to him, Cody's father in turn would kill Ricky, and then his father would either receive the death penalty or be locked in prison forever, and then Cody and his family would no longer have their father. So more of that coercive tactic, that fear tactic. Special Agent David Burns learned of this instance while conducting his bank fraud investigation into Ricky Howard, as well as 5 other young men with the same story as Cody. Ricky would explain away these allegations. It was also revealed to Agent Burns that at one point in time, after Cody had stepped forward to law enforcement, that police wired one of the young boys who had been subjected to Ricky's abuse. They sent him into the bank to speak with Ricky in person. And when confronted, Ricky admitted to all of the abuse. Police heard it. But when the young boy returned back, well, maybe at this point, young man, returned back to the police vehicle where the wire recording was occurring, the police noticed that something had malfunctioned and no confession was recorded. So they couldn't charge Ricky Howard with sexual abuse or assault on these young boys. Agent Burns was at an impasse. A sexual assault is not in the purview.
I don't understand why it has to be a recorded confession when you've got 5 victims that are there and the police heard him say it. And I understand that because it wasn't recorded, it would be, I guess, hearsay in a court of law. But why can't those 5 victims say, he did this to me?
Whatever it wasn't enough for the police force. I also think we should consider, again, the dynamic
of young men having to go publicly and say that a man assaulted them.
Yes.
No, I'm aware.
I think that's a deciding factor, and I also think we're talking about, again, a small community, a small town. I would never suggest that there might have been an idea for any of these people of mutually assured destruction, but I don't feel like I could. I don't necessarily know if I could rule it out. So at this point in time, Agent Burns comes to an impasse. Sexual assault charges are not within the purview of the federal government, but rather the state. His command offered that he should focus on the bank fraud cases that he was investigating, and not the sexual assault. Ultimately, Ricky Howard was charged, indicted, and tried for his bank fraud crimes.
And sentenced. What was he sentenced to?
Despite the severity of the allegations, Ricky had managed to evade significant legal consequences for years, protected by his status and the community's reluctance to believe the worst in him. Now, for this bank fraud case, Ricky Howard was charged with 5 years in prison.
And this was 1997?
The year 2000 is when Special Agent Burns was investigating him. Cody Waldrip had shared with his family in October of 1997 what had happened to him at Ricky's hands.
Okay.
But it was while Special Agent Burns was there doing the bank fraud case that he had heard from one of the bank patrons that her son had been sexually assaulted by him, which then ultimately led to him investigating further and finding out that the local police force had sent in another young boy who's never named in this instance to go in and ask Ricky while wearing a wire. And then again, nothing came of that. In May 2015, Ricky's possession of firearms, despite his felony conviction, provided law enforcement with a leverage point. Where was Caleb Diehl? However, Ricky remained uncooperative, and the prosecution faced challenges in building a case against him for Caleb's disappearance. So although they knew, like you, or felt like you, that Ricky Howard was responsible for Caleb Diehl's disappearance, they still didn't have enough to charge him with it. By June of 2016, Ricky Howard's facade began to crack. He pleaded guilty to charges unrelated to Caleb's case, but related to his fraudulent activities and illegal possession of firearms. Caleb's case, however, went cold. Despite the majority of the community of Nakona previously genuflecting and protecting Ricky in the past, community members began to come forward and share how they had known that Ricky Howard was a pedophile for years. It's so incredibly sad as you're watching the docuseries and you hear Chad Diehl, the father, talk about how after the fact of his son going missing and Ricky being put in prison and being charged and sentenced, that no one ever mentioned to him in all the time he lived there that Ricky Howard was a pedophile. And he trusted him.
It makes me think of at the beginning when you were asking me the question about this sense of protecting each other and that it's not actually safe. It is just perceived as safe.
Correct.
For this reason.
Exactly. The next big break in the case would come roughly a year later on April 25th, 2017. Tammy Diehl made a chilling discovery
Nope.
while cleaning a seldom used cabinet in her bathroom above the bathtub. So Tammy's home was in Nakona, and she and I believe at least Courtney were cleaning her home. And from what I understand, there was like a cabinet or set of cabinets above the bathtub, which no one ever used because it was in a weird place.
Right.
So they decided to go on this like deep cleaning binge.
I'm not saying that it was an old house, but it sounds like an old house to me, where you've got these random cabinets that are too high to be practical to use.
Yeah.
Like at my dad's house, and that house is probably close to 150 years old.
Wow.
There are suspiciously high cabinets, and it's like
suspiciously high cabinets.
could easily be bodies up there because the ceilings are really high.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
Oh, God, I love high ceilings though.
oh yeah, I lived in an apartment that had 9-foot or 10-foot ceilings. That was nice. I loved that.
Nice. Wow. Anyways, inside of this cabinet, Tammy discovered a plastic bag. And within this plastic bag was a covert camera clock radio. Missing an SD card, but still the covert clock radio that Ricky Howard had mentioned Caleb stealing early on in the investigation. In the bag was also a manual on defeating a polygraph test. Additionally, there were sets of handwritten questions that would be asked of a pedophilic offender during a polygraph exam. And further yet, a tape recorder with a recording of Ricky Howard conducting said polygraph questions and exam on himself. The items pointed to a disturbing preparedness that Caleb might have made before his disappearance. And while we don't know what he was going to do with these materials, we can speculate that there was a perceived Caleb Diehl, Ricky Howard confrontation on the horizon.
I believe that
I opine, I posit.
I am of the opinion that Caleb, obviously did take the covert camera clock.
It's, listeners, to give you an understanding of what this looked like, it was a kind of cubic looking clock that had an AM FM radio slider about midway down on the clock itself, and the top half was the clock portion, and then there were some knobs at the bottom, and in that front-facing cover, there was a small transparent hole where the covert clock was located and would shoot through the bottom of the face of the clock. So just to give you an idea of what it looked like.
I mean, it's the same type of stuff that they find throughout rental properties or even hotels.
Yeah.
Where they've got all the tricks to check to see if there are covert cameras in those places.
You know, they even sell on Amazon hidden camera detectors now.
Mm-hmm. This would have been in the early days of those, though.
Very early days of those.
But obviously, it seems that Caleb was aware that this clock had a camera because he wasn't just taking it for funsies.
Right. Well, and because Tammy Diehl is brilliant and committed to her son and finding him, she immediately reaches back out to the DA's office, including Chris Hamilton, who's now a judge, Kevin Benton, and informed them of the discovery. And then they looped back in FBI agent Burns. Agent Burns was made aware that Ricky Howard, the man he had put away years and years ago, was now at the center as the primary suspect in Caleb Diehl's disappearance.
Is possession of child pornography a federal offense?
So that's a great question. And the possession or anything to do with child pornography becomes a federal matter.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yes.
It's the loophole with which they can bring the FBI back into it because they were looking for...
And that was the suspicion, that if he had this covert clock radio...
Yeah, what a way to... I mean, the recording of his, the tape recording of his own voice was one thing, but to really... If that hadn't been there, they would have been so confused by this clock radio with the covert camera in it.
Well, listen, it's going to get weirder.
Okay.
Ricky Howard was the main suspect in Caleb's case for some time, but solid evidence had been really elusive However, during this period, it is revealed that the federal judge who sentenced Ricky for bank fraud in the early 2000s had taken the unusual step of including mandatory sex offender treatment in his sentencing. So, while Agent Burns had not been allowed to pursue anything related to child sexual assault, the judge had been informed and made that part of his sentencing. Now, a lot of this treatment for sex offenders actually occurs post release, and this treatment included regular polygraph exams. During these polygraph exams, Ricky admitted to having a sexual attraction to young boys, including disturbing fantasies about his own 14-year-old nephew. Ricky shared that he dreamed about his nephew frequently and vividly.
Was his nephew Caleb?
No.
Not actually his nephew?
No, I don't believe so. That's not what's intimated in the series.
Okay. So now we're
talking about a deep paraphilia, perversion.
right, but now we're talking incest.
Yes. Ricky said that he began really fantasizing about his nephew after he wrestled with the teen and became aroused. Additionally, Ricky's treating psychologist said that it was clear that Ricky tried to game and manipulate the polygraph exams during his treatment, but that he often failed. Lastly, the psychologist shared some of the most critical information about Ricky Howard. He had an insatiable porn appetite. These revelations led investigators to revisit the burned computers on Ricky's property.
They didn't address...
With the search warrant in hand, authorities approached Ricky's ex-wife, who confirmed the existence of another family computer. Ricky's ex-wife gladly handed over the device, and investigators secured a warrant to search the tech. The computer, when examined, revealed hundreds upon hundreds of child pornography images. Now,
Homemade?
they don't definitively say that this batch is homemade, but they do share that they find really suggestive pictures of Caleb Diehl. Now, the photographs they find of him do not qualify as child pornography according to Texas state law.
Right. They're just suggestive.
Very suggestive and very suspicious. Now, as they continued their search and investigation, further searches led investigators to Tennessee. You see, Ricky had family members who had just recently relocated to Tennessee. When investigators approached the family members and asked about possible technology that was linked to Ricky, the family produced a laptop. Among other incriminating activities and videos and images, this laptop contained photos and potentially videos of Ricky Howard molesting Caleb Diehl and the very camper that had been previously searched. The pictures were clear and the evidence was damning.
Only Caleb?
There were others.
Okay.
But Caleb Diehl specific. The DA investigators Hamilton and Benton asked Chad Diehl to identify the people in the photos. So, Chad Diehl was subjected to identifying Ricky Howard and his missing son in these photographs of his son's sexual assault. Both Chad Diehl and Tammy Diehl struggled with immense guilt, feeling they had failed to protect their son from a predator they had trusted. With this new evidence, the DA's office took the case to a federal prosecutor, as the federal government does have jurisdiction over child pornography cases. Ricky Howard was charged with possession of child pornography and sexual exploitation of a child. He was indicted, and despite initially denying the charges, Ricky ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges of child sexual exploitation involving Caleb Diehl. As a part of Ricky's plea deal, other charges were dropped, including those concerning other young men and 12 other counts of possession of child pornography.
Why? Why, in pleading guilty to the exploitation of Caleb, when they don't know where Caleb's body is and they have this person who is very likely the number one person of interest at the very least, if
Correct.
not suspect. And that would be the bargaining chip that you could use. I don't care if he pleads guilty to abusing Caleb as much as, one, all of these people deserve justice.
Mm-hmm.
So none of their cases should be dropped just because he pled guilty to one. But then two, we don't know where Caleb is, and he very likely does, in my opinion.
So I think, and I can't say this for sure because I don't know, and I am going to talk about a few things that might get a little more understandable potentially. But what I will say is that I don't know, I don't believe that the authorities had enough information to try and charge him with Caleb's murder.
I'm not saying to charge him with murder.
I know, but what I'm saying is they knew that if he pleaded guilty to that crime that he did, they could at least give him 30 years in prison. And so I think it might have been more of a move to say, I can at least get this sex offender, this pedophile, put away in prison. And although you're right, it's not a fair exchange. I don't feel good about it. Where's the justice for the other victims? I can't understand saying, at least this puts him away.
I mean, I guess because they don't have enough to charge him with murder, if he tells them, then they will, and then he will be charged with murder, which would be a guaranteed the rest of his life in prison.
Well, and then I think you also have to consider, if we're talking about this small town, this small county of Montague, I think it also presents the idea of how impartial could your jury be if it goes to trial? What are the chances that one of your 9 jurors ends up refusing to find you guilty because they know you? I don't know. I think they were probably trying to play with a weird set of cards.
I think that you are really underestimating how much people, regardless of how well they know you, at this point, the community has accepted that he is responsible for the sexual abuse of these young men.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you would be hard pressed.
Think of all of the people who apologize for abusers and all of the people who apologize for those who commit sexual assault, for pedophiles.
Not for children. But
Cameron, they do. There are apologists.
But they did that in the beginning because they didn't want to believe it because they'd heard the rumors and whatnot, but they didn't want to give any credence to it.
Like, oh, he can be reformed. Or, oh, he did that because of demonic possession. Or, oh, he did that for... Like, there are people who, and I'm not saying it's a majority, but those apologists exist. There are also people who, they will defend somebody that they know or that they care about with prejudice, right? I think that you're putting a lot to chance, especially when there's not a body.
I'm not talking murder.
I know. I understand. I get that. But I'm just saying, if we're talking about getting full punishment.
This is a federal case. That's 12 jurors.
Is a regular jury not 9?
No, 12.
12. Mm-hmm. 12 jurors.
But it depends. There are some courts that have... Like, depending on what it is, there are 6 jurors, or they're not all 12.
Whatever. So I don't know. I'm just saying that I'm sure that these prosecutors had myriad details they had to work out. I feel like they probably sought justice to the best of their ability. That's what I think. But I do understand your sentiments.
Barring other pedophiles, I don't think it would have been that difficult to convict on this case. There were images, there were videos, there were
potential
victims.
Videos. I'm not sure if there were videos or not.
There were images. There were other victims. There was at least one who was willing to get wired. So I would be, even if none of the other ones wanted to step up and say, I think that one would probably...
So, yes, that had been, at that point, 23 years or 21 years ago for that person.
Okay, life expectancy is still...
I know, but what I'm saying is that this person who did wear the wire, they did that 21 years prior to this instance. Mm-hmm. They might have said, I'm done. I moved on. I don't want to rehash this. You know what I mean? I think there's all kinds of factors, and I wish I knew all of them. Much like you, Caleb's sister Courtney emphasized that Caleb was not the only victim, and that all of the voices of the abused should be heard. Ginger Waldrip, Cody Goolsby's sister, spoke about the lifelong impact of Ricky's abuse on her brother and others. On October 27th, 2021, Caleb's father, Chad, delivered a victim impact statement in court. In a remarkable display of strength and faith, he told Ricky Howard that he forgave him. While relieved that Ricky would finally face the consequences of his actions, Tammy Diehl still grappled with the reality that her son was gone. Despite Ricky Howard's conviction, the central question remains unanswered. Where is Caleb Diehl? Never Seen Again reached out to Ricky Howard's lawyers, asking if Ricky had killed Caleb. The lawyers responded to other questions, but remained silent on this one.
Duh.
It's so weird to me that they would answer other questions
What were the
and
other
not
questions?
just say no.
Were the other questions about his conviction that he actually had?
I'm not sure. It doesn't say at the end of the docuseries what questions they asked. It just says that among other questions they asked if Ricky Howard had killed Caleb Diehl, and his lawyers decided to not answer that question. Every February, as Caleb's birthday approaches, Tammy feels a deep sense of grief. Caleb celebrated his 18th birthday on March 15th, 2015, and 2 weeks later, he vanished. Chad Diehl finds comfort in his faith, drawing parallels to the biblical story of Job, who faced immense suffering yet remained faithful. In Never Seen Again, Chad Diehl talks about Job's 7 sons and 3 daughters being taken. Job addresses his wife and says, "Shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord, and not evil also?" Chad believes that through their suffering, he has gained greater empathy and compassion, and he hopes for greater forgiveness amongst the community of Nakona. He reminds us all that silence is consent. So there are some things that Chad Diehl says that I do not agree with. Just in terms of, I don't think you have to liken your experience to the experience of Job, where all of his children were struck down by God. However, I understand taking comfort in your faith.
Yeah.
I also think that the idea that silence is consent is a really insidious way to, and not that he is, but to sometimes place blame on victims, because issues of coercion make it very, and embarrassment and shame make it very difficult for those survivors to come forward. On August 20th, 2023, the Diehl family was honored with the passage of Senate Bill 129, known as Caleb's Law, which strengthens child pornography laws in Texas. And when I say that the Diehl family was honored, there was this reception at a reception hall. They kind of all celebrated the passage of Senate Bill 129. Caleb's family continues to remember him as a thoughtful young man who gave the best gifts. Caleb's Law updates penalties for child pornography possession and updates child pornography statutes for the first time in 30 years, addressing the technological changes that have occurred since 1989. Caleb's Law also allows for first-time offenders to be charged based on the number of images they possess. Harsher penalties have also been introduced, especially for those with large quantities of such images. The law was unanimously passed in both the House and Senate. After disappearing a little over 9 years ago, Caleb would be 27 today. Caleb's strawberry blonde hair would likely still be cut short, and estimates of his height range from 5'11 to 6'2. Caleb's family, while relieved that Ricky Howard will remain in prison for at least 30 years, still hope for the closure that might come from finding Caleb or his body. Caleb's disappearance is still an open investigation, and according to the Montague County District Attorney's Office, the case is still being actively pursued, and they will continue to do so until they find more answers. Kevin Bunton, the now judge who did work as a former DA, has shared that if anyone has information related to Caleb Diehl and his last known whereabouts, or any information at all regarding him and Ricky Howard, to please come forward, because even one small piece of evidence can plug holes in a case that might only be missing a piece. If you have any information on Caleb Ray Diehl's disappearance, please contact 1-800-CALL-FBI or 940-894-2871.
They haven't been able to execute search warrants or anything on the property?
So here's the really wild, I shouldn't say this is the really wild, because a lot of it is very wild. But in the case of Caleb Diehl, essentially, after he is convicted and pleads guilty to the child sexual exploitation charges, there is no new information about Caleb Diehl or Ricky Howard. The most recent piece came from a Dallas-Fort Worth local area news source that says and talks about how the Diehl family was honored for the passage of Caleb's Law. And even if you pursue avenues like Reddit and other threads, there's like no speculation about Caleb Diehl. No kind of minor update, nothing about what people have heard, which is kind of weird because a lot of times you can go to those message boards and at least find something. But in Caleb Diehl's case,
Because
nothing.
it's so obvious what happened.
Yeah, I suppose. It was weirdly frustrating to not be able to do any kind of additional follow-up. Because even in instances of missing persons, you can usually find theories or ideas or what people have been talking about in the local community, and none of that's available.
But he went missing at Howard's property. I know that that's not necessarily official, but
Right.
that's what happened because, oh, he took my truck because
Well, he was driving his truck.
Okay.
Remember, he had been driving.
he had been driving his truck, but then mysteriously the truck, he finds it on his property. Well, maybe we should go looking in case we find another truck and or body on his property.
Yeah, I really don't know if they've conducted more searches of the Howard property. I know that they had, I believe, cadaver dogs out there. I know that they've been to his properties. There's been no real kind of follow-up. One of the most frustrating things about this case to me is that when Ricky Howard was tried for bank fraud and those sexual assault allegations kind of came to the surface, the federal judge sentenced him to sex offender,
Right.
typical punishment for sex offenders, right? And none of that is brought to light or exposed until we're years into the investigation of Caleb Diehl's disappearance.
It does seem like a weird thing to. It seems weird that the judge would even be allowed to do that without there being a recording of his confession that he.
And even that special agent Burns talks about how it was something he'd never seen before. He'd never seen a judge hand down this kind of sentencing with the elements of the sexual offender punishment and rehabilitation. And he said he's not seen it afterwards. He's never even heard of it in any other circumstances. And so it is odd. And it's like you were saying, without that recording, what did they have to go on other than...
Which is what the letter of the law says, but it seems like there's, like the judge in this case practiced common sense. that the recording had just been compromised in some way, but that the confession was made and that officers of the law did hear the confession be made. They just didn't have the recording of it. They had the victim who had been wired, and it just seems like...
Like, how was he able to provide that kind of sentencing? What made the representation for Ricky Howard say, yes, that's an acceptable condition?
I don't know, other than...
Like, what was the justification?
Other than the reason that you're not being tried for that is because of a loophole or a technological glitch. Otherwise, this trial would be very different.
Yeah. It also makes me wonder, this SD card that was missing from the covert clock radio camera, where is it? What was on it? We can assume that it had material containing Caleb Diehl being exploited. Was that what was found on the computer in Tennessee?
Maybe. We can definitely assume that it had the exploitation of at least one person on it. But I do think that if I were Caleb, that would be the valuable part that I would take with me and not throw above the bathtub.
Well, and part of what I'm thinking, and I've been thinking about this since yesterday,
Is blackmail.
Is Caleb Diehl, I assume, at some point confronted Ricky Howard.
Because he's fearless.
Yes. And I think that Caleb Diehl was smart enough to do it in front of the covert camera clock radio.
Right.
And when he took it with him, I think he assumed he would be able to get that footage off of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what he probably thought he got, was a confrontation that maybe had been captured with him and Ricky Howard. having a conversation about what Ricky Howard had done. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So what is on that stupid SD card?
Or where is it?
Yeah, I don't know. Ricky Howard, he had plenty of time to do whatever with whatever evidence he needed to.
Mm-hmm. Time and resources.
Yeah.
Land on land on land.
Oil leases. Cattle. Like it doesn't sound like money was an object to him.
Well, no, he'd just take out a fake loan. That was infuriating. It is infuriating.
It's pretty disgusting. It's a terrible case on the whole.
Yeah, because it's one of those where you know what happened, but the person who's responsible, in my opinion, is not being held accountable for it.
And there is no recourse for his other victims.
Right. Thank you so much for telling me that.
You're so very welcome. I hope it keeps you up at night.
Yeah. A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe and drop us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening.
We would appreciate it so much. It helps us tremendously. Recommend us to a friend and make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
And like us on Facebook at Until the End of Crime. And join our discussion group.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so send us an email with questions, requests, or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.